Hey, what's up, all you art geeks out there? Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about black and white painting. I have not painted that much in black and white lately. This is one of the first paintings I've done in basically black and white for a good few months. And I know you've seen some of my other paintings. You go, Josh, hey, you're painting in black and white all the time. I've seen your other work. Well, I usually don't go this black and white. This painting in particular, I'd say is as close to black and white as possible. Now I am using three colors. I'm using ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and titanium white. Those are the three colors. Now the reason I did that is because I wanted to be able to control the temperature a little bit. I wanted it to be a little bit cooler in the shadows, and then I also wanted to be a little bit warmer in the highlights. So that was kind of the main reason for three colors. I felt like I got a little bit more control so I could play with temperature just a touch. It's essentially a black painting. As we go through this, you're going to see that it's a black and white painting. I do end up throwing color on the second layer just to show what we could do with that black and white at the end. This actually is a Patreon tutorial, so go over to my Patreon account if you want to see the full tutorial. I also added the second part, the part where I add the blue to it. That's the second tutorial in this series, so you get to check out both of those tutorials over on my Patreon account, so check that out. And just to give you a quick heads up on how I'm creating this black paint and how I'm controlling the temperature, I'm mixing the ultramarine blue and the burnt umber together to make it black. And depending on if you use a little bit more burnt umber or a little bit more ultramarine blue, you're going to have a slightly cooler or slightly warmer black or gray, depending on how they're mixed. So that's just kind of how I'm controlling the temperature, that very slight amount, even though it's essentially black and white. Just want to give you a quick heads up on that before I forget. Now, the reason I'm talking about black and white today is just because it's a really great way to learn how to paint. If you're switching to oil paint and you're trying to just get a handle on things, I think just doing a black and white painting is such a great, cheap way to just check out oil paints in general. Say you're switching from acrylic, maybe you're switching from just drawing with pencil or charcoal, color pencils, whatever it is. But if you're switching to a new medium, I think black and white is a great way to try it out to see if it's for you, because you can just buy a handful of colors. Burnt umber, extremely cheap color. Ultramarine blue, very cheap color. Titanium white. All three of these colors are very cheap. So you can go to any store, Michael's, Dick Blick online, Jerry's, Artorama. All these are great places to go to buy colors. But these are the cheapest line of colors, essentially, and you can do a lot with just these three. In this painting in particular, I'm using Michael Harding for my ultramarine blue, and then I'm using Winsor Newton for the burnt umber, and then my titanium white is from Lucas, which is a little bit more expensive. I'd say the Michael Harding and the Lucas are the pricier ones. Winsor Newton's definitely on the cheaper side, but still all three really high quality paint. Now, as far as what you can learn with black and white oil painting, I think one of the biggest things, one of the most obvious things that I think about when it comes to black and white and what you can really learn and what you can get really good at is values or tonal range, composition. These are three things. When I think about a painting, being successful, I think it has to have a great tonal composition. This is something I put in my mind first and foremost. I almost feel like it is the foundation of any successful painting, is having a great tonal composition. Now, what does that mean, tonal composition? Well, I guess the simplest way to put it would be that tonal composition is just how you're arranging light and dark across the entire painting surface. So if you're painting a portrait and you're putting that portrait in the middle of your painting like this one, and you have a white background, and then you're using some midtones, some highlights, some darker areas towards the middle of your overall painting surface, that is naturally a good composition. Portraits lend themselves to being in the middle of your painting surface. So naturally, you're going to have a fairly decent chance of having a good composition just by putting the head somewhere in the middle of your surface. Now, there's a lot of different subtle things that you can do to make it better or worse. A lot of it has to do with maybe how far you zoom in, how much negative space you have around your painting. If you have too much negative space, it'll feel like there's just this tiny little head floating in the middle. Maybe that will end up causing you to show way more of the body. Since you're going to be zoomed out so far, you're going to see the head down to maybe the mid range of the body, maybe the mid torso area. that zooming in level is a big part of composition. And the further in you zoom, the more intense it may feel. The further out you go, the more it'll allow you to play with backgrounds and what the environment is around the subject. But somewhere in the middle, like this painting, I'd say is a good average where you're seeing the shoulders towards the bottom. They're getting cut off right as the shoulders kind of swoop out. And that's about all you're seeing for the shoulders in this one, but that is a good typical composition. Now you could zoom in just a little bit more, zoom out a little bit more, and you'd still be fine. You'd still be in good shape, but a lot of it has to do with also the shape of your canvas. Are you using a square canvas? Are you using a 9x12 like this one? 9x12s are great. They're naturally good for a portrait composition. Square works too. Square can be a little tricky though. And then if you get into like say a landscape where you're in a landscape orientation where it's way wider than it is tall, that can be very difficult. Portraits usually don't lend themselves to being in landscape mode. That's why when you look at other portrait artists out there, most of their paintings are either square or a little bit more narrow in the width than the height of the painting. So I like to use anything from like an 8x10 aspect ratio, 9x12. There's 30x40 inch paintings I like to do. There's 16x20s. All of these are great portrait aspect ratios, all way to square. I've done some really successful square ones. The square ones can be probably the most tricky to get the composition to be correct. But just by painting in black and white, you get to learn about all of these different aspect ratios to your painting surface and how they can affect your overall tonal composition. So another thing, we're talking about tonal range. This lends itself to thinking about values. Another big thing that you can really start to think about, if you're jumping from graphite or charcoal or some other black and white medium, you've already got your mind set on seeing tonal range and seeing values and seeing the subtle shadow changes in a portrait when you're looking at a reference image, those subtle little changes in light and dark. If you've been painting or if you've been drawing in black and white, you already have a knack for this. Now, if you're not doing very good, if you feel like you're just not very good at drawing with pencil or drawing with charcoal and you're just not really getting the values figured out, I don't think it's going to get any easier with oil paint because you're adding a lot of extra stuff that you have to think about when painting with oils. But for me in particular, when I tried to switch from drawing when I was a kid and then going over to acrylics and then trying to do my first portrait, it was a complete disaster because I tried to jump in and do all of these fancy skin tones and I didn't know what I was doing. I was so used to black and white that the second I switched over to color and I was like, oh, I'll just try my first color portrait after only doing a handful of other things in color, it was a complete disaster. I gave up after a couple of days of trying to figure it out, and it's because it ended up very flat. It didn't look right value-wise. I wasn't comfortable doing value and color at the same time. Now, looking back, I think the reason I was such a failure when it came to painting a color portrait for the first time was I didn't fully understand color mixing yet. I had just switched over from drawing with pencils and doing charcoal. I always felt like I was pretty good at understanding tones and values and things like that. But when I switched over to acrylic paint, I had no clue on how to do any color mixing. So I had to make the realization that I just wasn't ready to do any fancy color work, especially with portraits. So I did a lot of foundational practice with color mixing, and that's something completely separate that you have to do. You have to go back and understand how to find any color there is. It's just a very slow process. You're going to have to take your time with that. But yes, just isolate these different things. Isolate black and white and figure out all the things you can learn with just black and white. Then think about color, and then you can finally start to combine the two and get comfortable, and you'll eventually get this warm, fuzzy feeling that, hey, I actually know what I'm doing. I can get more and more bold with what I'm trying to do. And of course, you're going to have failures. You're going to have moments where you're like, okay, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. You have to kind of backtrack a bit, figure out what you did wrong. But with black and white, there's so many things that you can learn just from 2 to 3 colors on your palette. So once you make that jump to color, just make sure you understand color. Check out all the tutorials you can online that have to do with color mixing and color theory and what colors look good together, because you're going to make a lot of poor choices. If you can't paint a successful black and white painting, you're never going to be able to paint a successful color painting before you have that figured out. So let's go ahead and assume that you are really good at pencil drawing. You've got really good instincts when it comes to value and tonal range and composition. Well, by switching to black and white paint, this will really give you a chance to get a feel for oil paint, to try out a lot of different mediums, to figure out if you like to paint thick or thin, if you like to use glazes, or if you like to paint opaque. There are a lot of different options as far as medium goes. I've kind of locked in on personally with just straight up linseed oil with some odorless mineral spirits, or some stand oil with odorless mineral spirits. Now, I've also used walnut oil, alkyd walnut oil. A lot of those alkyds out there, though, I get a little nervous using them because I always feel like there's going to be some bad thing that's going to happen down the road where it's going to darken or something like that. I've heard a lot of bad stories about resins and alkyds that cause darkening in your paintings. And sometimes I'll even go into forums like wetcanvas.com and I will see what other people have done with mediums to see if they've had success or if they've had darkening. And some will say they've had darkening with one particular medium, and then the next person will chime in and say, I've never had any issue. I don't know what you're talking about. So I think maybe it all depends on the artist and how much they're using it and the ways they're using it. But try a lot of different mediums. I'd say linseed oil all by itself or walnut oil. Any of these mediums will work great. It's really just about getting used to painting wet into wet. I think that's the one place where a lot of people get a little bit scared with oil paint, is this idea that they're going to paint into already wet paint. And you get used to that. I think some get used to it a little bit quicker than others. Some people are a little bit more comfortable with just getting a quick pass down and not really painting wet into wet too much, letting it dry and then doing glazes on top of that to subtly add color. And then some like to paint like me, where it's just opaque about every brush stroke's opaque. There's nothing really transparent about anything they do. And that's just my particular method. I like the way it creates a style for me of showing little windows into my previous layers versus showing slight transparent glazes on top of layers where you can see the slow buildup and gradual buildup of color. And it's all about your personal preference, and you get to decide what you do with all of these different mediums that are out there. So once you get really comfortable with oil paint, feel free to let it dry and then paint some color. Maybe try a few different colors on top of the painting you already created to see if you can maybe mimic the tonal range that you've created with the black and white, and then add color on top. Slowly add color, try glazes, try opaque, try semi-opaque, whatever you want to do. And you get a lot of different ways to learn about oil painting just by keeping things as simple color-wise as possible. So that's just my general thoughts on black and white painting, why it's so beneficial. At the end of the day, the biggest thing that I think painting black and white will do is it helps you to focus on specific things. Tonal range, it'll help you with compositional skills, it'll help you understand the dynamics of light and shadow and how to just subtly shade things, how to more dramatically shade things. There's so many different little technical skills that you're going to learn just by having black and white paint. It's going to help you decide what kind of painter you want to be. Do you want to be an impressionist painter? Do you want to be an expressionist painter? Do you want to be a realist painter? It'll help you decide if you want to use glazes or if you want to paint opaque. It's going to help you reduce the complexity of learning all of these different things. So, and I think as a whole, if you're just transferring from doing graphite or charcoal, it's really going to help you transfer those skills over a lot easier if you go from black and white pencil drawings to black and white painting. You can leave the color as a separate thing to learn, and once you start to feel comfortable, you can combine those two things and start thinking of values and color at the same time. So there's a lot of different ways to learn. I know when I was learning, I didn't have an exact roadmap. I just knew that I had pretty decent skills in drawing already, so I was really focused mostly on color. But if you're just doing the switch now, you want to see if you like the way oil paint feels. Black and white's a great way to try it out. So hopefully this was helpful. I know I rambled on quite a bit. I didn't have anything planned, just me thinking about oil paint and thinking about why black and white's such a useful way to paint and why it'll help you learn. And even if you've already learned how to paint with color, it's always fun to just go back and do a black and white painting like this one. Of course, yes, I do add the blue paint, but again, it's sort of a secondary thought. It's a separate thought. It made me think just purely values, especially for the Patreon tutorial. It helped to teach values in that tutorial. But then I also got to show, hey, this is how you can throw a splash of blue on if you want. So check that out if you want over on my Patreon account. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you all very much for checking out another video, all you art geeks out there. I will talk to you again very soon. Bye.